Signore e signori, sono molto emozionato all'idea di chiedervi di ascoltarmi prima di pranzo e soprattutto al domani di una difficile partita di calcio. Continuerò in inglese. And I'm going to start with a very simple question, which is the following. So the question is this: do we know what we are doing as antitrust jurists? So outside of antitrust circles, one argument is drawing a lot of attention and support. The argument is very simple. You, I, us together, we are perpetrating a socially constructed power structure. Katarina Pistor, a professor of law in the United States, writes that property, contracts, and trust laws are subverted by attorneys to promote and generate private wealth, entrench a capitalistic system, and aggravate economic inequality. Pistor adds that antitrust law and other public laws like taxation do very little to correct the problem. I quote, "The masters of the code of capital, that is the private attorneys who fashion different assets as capital, mostly in private law, also tend to have privileged access to regulators and tax authorities, and often vet their coding power and strategies with them before applying them." Okay, so arguments about the social construction of antitrust law are not academic fantasies like that people on the hills of Fiesole like to discuss. The influence of neo-Brandeisianism on the antitrust conversation, maybe more than in the case, is a clear sign of this. Though it's slightly different from the Pistor arguments with its narrow focus on corporate bigness, the idea remains one of a power structure. Large law firms, large companies, large tech platforms, lobbyists, and hired academics enjoy the power to influence market outcomes and political processes. So any jurist who's done a little bit of non-academic work, be it in public enforcement or in the private sector, on whatever side, complainant or defendant, any jurist that has this practical experience understands that legal systems are too heterogeneous and diverse to work as denounced. Political economy theories of law overstates the description of legal systems as power structured, constructed by group-based hierarchies to dominate others. To be true, such theories would require an implausibly high degree of time consistency, coalition-building investments, and value alignments. In short, political economy theories of law are just one small step away from conspiracy theory. Okay? So I submit here that law as a messy life, and as Justice Holmes once wrote, the life of the law is not logic, it is experience. So now, if antitrust law is not a socially constructed power structure, what can it be? What is it? That question is not a question that we tend to answer well as antitrust jurists, and oftentimes we think it's really not relevant to think about this. I think the question is relevant because absent a good understanding of what we antitrust jurists do as a social practice, we expose ourselves to the costs of non-theory, we expose ourselves to the perils of simplistic, populistic, and ideological lazy conspiracy theories. Okay, without some theoretical awareness about what we are doing, it's very hard to push back against bad proposals for law reform or to promote good proposals for law reform. If you come to the discussion with the tag sign of a power-structured member of a group coalition that tries to dominate others, of course, you're dismissed from the outset. So perhaps we need to work together to build a more realistic theory of antitrust law. So one such theory consists of understanding our antitrust legal system as a system of knowing. Okay? So if I would put that in jargonic terms that academics like, I would say antitrust law is an epistemological system. In other words, the system of antitrust law seeks the truth about the interest it's trying to protect. So, while civil law tries to seek the truth about freedom of contract and autonomy of will, antitrust law tries to seek the truth about competition and restraints of competition. And the process that the legal system that is truth-seeking follows consists in selecting legal facts. So a legal fact in civil law will be consent. A legal fact in antitrust law will be an agreement that will tell you that there's coordination, the invert opposite to competition. To establish the legal facts, the legal system will try to accept or reject some empirical facts. In civil law, the requirement of a written document is an empirical fact that allows to establish the legal fact. In antitrust law, the empirical facts relevant to establish an agreement are things like a concurrence of wills or a meeting of the minds. Now, the point I want to make here, to make it maybe clear and simple, is that what determines what an antitrust law system is the sum total of all the choices of the relevant facts deemed relevant to apply the law, know whether there's competition or no competition. In other words, the accumulation and aggregation of all the facts that we decide to bring in the antitrust system to know if there's competition, and all the facts that we decide to exclude as non-indicative of competition tells us what the antitrust law system is, what it is. Okay, so these choices, they can be, the choices that we make about facts, they can be conceptualized under two types. So we make choices of inclusion and choices of exclusion. For instance, US and EU competition law includes in the assessment of single firm conduct a consumer welfare filter, a choice of inclusion. By adding the consumer welfare filter to the evaluation of exclusionary conduct, competition law seeks to understand the difference between elimination of efficient rivalry that leads to lower prices and elimination of inefficient rivalry that leads to higher prices. Okay? We also do choices of exclusion, or facts that we deem irrelevant to apply the law. For instance, mergers that do not lead to an increase in prices on a product market can be cleared, even if they lead to wage cuts and unemployment and labor markets. In other words, we exclude from our understanding of competition and of monopoly facts that happen on labor markets. We don't look at them. Okay, why is this relevant? So, when we look at the antitrust system as the sum of hundreds of choices of exclusion and inclusion of legal and empirical facts, we realize that the antitrust system cannot be ideological. This is because there are determinants that constrain these choices that we make to include and exclude legal facts. There are four determinants: legal structure, politics, science, and culture. I'm just going to focus on two of them. The first determinant, structure, is statutory text and institutions. The black letter law matters. In Europe, the law is very specified compared to the US antitrust statutes. The language of Article 101 talks of undertakings, talks of competition, and there's an exemption in Article 101(3). In the US, Section 1 of the Sherman Act talks broadly of any person, not undertaking, doesn't talk about competition, talks about trade, and there's no exemption. The text of the European law allows less flexibility in choices of inclusion and exclusion. By contrast, the legal system in the US is so broad that it permits a lot of interpretation and choices of exclusion and inclusion. Okay, second determinant I want to talk about, culture. US antitrust law is a North American invention, of course. European antitrust law is also a North American invention by many regards. Now, when we think about these two systems that we have, US versus European, there's a strong difference, a big difference. The US antitrust law system is based in absolute faith in the merits of competition as a social arrangement. With that, the US antitrust system works towards the exclusion of additional facts, non-competition facts, in antitrust investigations. In December, Linekan, chairman of the FTC, pro-enforcement person, said that ESG won't stop the FTC, meaning that facts about sustainability will be excluded from antitrust consideration. Okay? Cross the Atlantic, move to Europe. In the EU system, where social or economically tangential objectives to competition play a role by virtue of the treaty, a more open, yet limited door has been made to the acceptance of sustainability arguments and efficiencies to compensate harm to competition in relation to horizontal cooperation agreements. Okay? So, what are the implications of a more epistemological understanding of the competition law system, a non-political one? That we as lawyers and jurists and economists, we have the system that we have because we debate in conferences like this one about the facts that are relevant to say that there is competition or there is monopoly, and the results of all these micro-choices lead us to the system that we have. What is the impact of that understanding of competition law? So the first impact is that the complex outcome of choice aggregation cannot just have to do with ideology. When we study choices of inclusion and exclusion, we can see very well that indeed no ideology drives these choices. There's many examples. Competition law prohibits territorial market protection when it is the result of an agreement, but refuses to see it when it is the result of vertical integration in a company. If there was a pro-internal market ideology, you would not see it limited by choices made in corporate organization. But still it is. The ideology meets the limits in the practice of, we don't want to break up firms, we don't want to look into the black box of the firm, it's too difficult. In addition to seeing inconsistency incompatible with ideology, we see that these choices of inclusion and exclusion, they do not correlate with a pro or anti-enforcement bias. Take the legal fact of potential competition. When we look at potential competition, it can be both the basis to prohibit conduct or transaction, like in the killer acquisition scenario, or it can both be the basis for larger market definitions that tend to limit exposure to antitrust liability. Okay? So now that this is understood, it is absolute bogus to describe antitrust law as a product of ideology. Of course, this doesn't mean that all is good and well in the realm of antitrust law. It doesn't mean that the state of epistemological equilibrium in which we are today is good. In other words, the question that we need to ask ourselves is whether our knowledge of restraints of competition as embodied into the legal system that we have aligns with the truths about about competition, right? Whether the laws that we have allow us to describe whether there is competition or monopoly in the economy, okay? So we are at the intersection of what Plato called the intersection of truth and belief. We want to evolve the system towards more truth, right? And we want to believe in more truth, and we need to search the truth outside of our belief. But we don't want to go into belief. Okay, so one of the problems that we have, of course, is that we operate a little bit in a state of epistemological unconsciousness. As the law develops incrementally through discrete choices of inclusion and exclusion, through conferences like these, we had some potential competition here, we removed some corporate integration there. It's very hard to track the reasons behind the choices of inclusion and exclusion, and it's very hard to track whether they are logical. So at some points in history, all our systems of antitrust law undergo a process of epistemological re-examination. That's what we had with the Chicago School in the 1960s, which cast a broad light on the fact that US antitrust law made no sense at the time, full of inconsistencies and paradoxes. And this may be what we're having now with the Neo-Brandeisian School, which tells us that what we've been doing is completely wrong, and we're missing a lot of competition. Now, my proposition to you, and I'll be short then, is that we should govern this process of epistemological re-examination of our laws by using a perspective informed by reason, science, and logic, just like in the good old universalist enlightened tradition. We should not fall for the sirens of ideology. We face a major opportunity to improve antitrust law. The challenge is to fall into very simplistic descriptions of competition and rivalry. The point that I want to make is we don't want to substitute our past preconceptions with new preconceptions. We need to study, we need science, we need to take time. So let me give you one example. The current attack on the consumer welfare standard. The consumer welfare standard is widely described in academia, but increasingly so in practice in the US, as a diktat of a Chicagoan neoliberal ideology. This is a straw man. Research has shown that signs of a consumer welfare standard pre-existed already in the 1920s, 40 years before the advent of the Chicago School. Courts use the consumer welfare framework to decide antitrust cases. By contrast, some choices that we make are not entirely neutral or science-based. If you take the idea of including innovation theories of harm in merger control, these choices are essentially ideological. We have cases that discuss innovation as a theory of harm. We have 0 cases discussing innovation as a theory of efficiency in merger cases. Why that? Why the asymmetrical treatment of innovation in merger review? This is a choice that's biased. Science and reason should tell us to discard this choice. So in the future, I think the work before us is not to fall simplistically to political economy narratives about competition law. The road we face is the road of work, research, and science. In 2005, former diplomat and public international law professor, I cannot move the slides, but Yes. Former diplomat and public international professor Koskamiani wrote a book called From Apology to Utopia. And Koskamiani's book was mostly an attempt to stimulate a reflection seeking to disentangle the assumptions underpinning public international law. Today, antitrust law is at a similar juncture. Unless we can explain what we, as antitrust jurists, we do, we risk being swayed by a description of our practice as one that just operates as a more or less conscious agent of a socially constructed power structure. So the best approach to this discussion is to do everything with a critical eye and emancipate ourselves from ideology or doctrine. We want to be non-religious, we want to be non-superstitious, we want to embrace the truth about competition, and we want to understand what competition is as a true fact, not as a belief. So that is the universalist message that I wanted to give here, and I hope it was not too high level. I thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you one day in Fiesole.